Okay, we are live. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Omakase Show webinar series. My name is Wawa or Olana Yara, and I'm hosting the series. And I have a few updates as usually. So, first one is that I will be speaking at Non-Fungible Conference in Lisbon. Let me just find this tweet. So basically, this Thursday, June 5th at 5:15 p.m. CET. Join me on the alpha stage. And as well, do support our show. You can do it by going directly on Twitter, find the Omakase Show, and there is this cash button, and you can send your donations in Ethereum. Yeah, okay. And today we have an amazing guest, and I've been actually trying to schedule this webinar for a while. We have Nicolas Sassoon, who is an incredible visual artist who manages a lot of incredible mediums, including computer art and coding and all of it. And it's like really complex dive into computer art in general. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. And can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your practice, and how you got into the space?
For sure. Thank you so much for having me. Uh, so, where do I start? I'll start a little bit about myself. I'm originally from France, from the southwest of France. I studied art in France, and then in 2008, I decided to move to Canada, and I've been living in Canada ever since. I started making art after art school, mostly online. Started my first blog in 2009 and started posting animations of different projects that at the time to me were more like sort of like sketches or studies for larger projects. I was using animation and computer drawing as a sort of almost like a sketchbook. But eventually, that side of my practice just became more and more important. I met a lot of people online during that time between 2009 2012. I was part of that particular wave of net art at the time, and that was sort of my entry point in I guess in the art world or different art communities. So digital drawing, digital animation is always at the center of my practice, and then it branches out into different forms. And so, over the last 15 years, I've explored a lot of different medium, installation, print, sculptures. I've also worked as a curator. I've co-founded a few art collectives. And yeah, I think my work is mostly known for the fact that I explore a visual language that is really heavily, inspired and informed by early computer graphics, notably graphics from the mid 80s to the early 90s, pixelated patterns, limited color palettes, very simple motions. And one particularity of my work is that it's not coded. It's actually, I sort of work a little bit like an analog animator, and we can talk more about that later on. But essentially, I guess there's different ways to approach this sort of aesthetics, and especially in Web3, a lot of people take the route of code and try to create algorithms to replicate this particular aesthetic. And I sort of took the more like visual analog route. And so, yeah, my practice, I often say that I'm sort of like an analog animator, but working in a digital environment.
I was sure you use creative coding, so yeah, my fault, my bad.
No,
But
no, it's all good. A lot of people think that way.
now we just have to uncover. We have to uncover your mediums. I know they're like quite complex, and I know that my understanding of the topic is quite like vague. So yeah, let's do it. Basically, this is the combination of architecture as a form that you are quite frequently working with, but then there is also a lot of pixel-inspired art inspired by early computer graphic.
Mhm.
But in general, can you just dive us through the medium itself?
Yeah, so when I started doing this work, if you actually scroll all the way down, I can talk about the first works.
Mm-hmm.
So like these first works, the sort of like the black and white one with a little bit of like red and yellow flashing. When I made those works in 2009, 2010, I was trying to make sculptures, and instead of directly making the sculptures, I was trying to make sketches for the sculptures. And so, for example, the cube with the edge cut off, the corner cut off, I wanted to make these sort of metal cubes or these cubes made out of some sort of like solid material. And I wanted the corner to be cut off, and the corner would reveal this different material. And so essentially, when I started exploring that particular visual language, the pixelated patterns and the flashing and this very simple sort of like visual vocabulary, I was trying to think of how to translate physical qualities, like how to translate the quality of metal, how to translate the quality of wood, how to translate the quality of water through a very, very minimal visual language. And I would say the first years of my practice have been really focused on that. Like this one, for example, that's great that you're bringing this one up, because that's usually the one I show when I talk about my work.
Incredible.
These were really inspired by cross sections of architectural building or technical drawings, and I was trying to represent water. I was trying to represent, where does the cross section start, where does it end, and so over the years, trying to establish my own language through this aesthetic. And these ones are drawn. So I start the work. I do most of the work on Photoshop. I mean, I could do it on another similar software, but I end up using the Adobe Creative Suite because it's a lot easier for me. And I hand draw the work. The animation is done through simple animating programs, and then I either use After Effects or Animate or different sort of compositing program to recompile the animation and export it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. So basically, I'm still keeping your artworks archive on the screen. Mm-hmm. Because I've been reading your interview, and I will just quote something that you said. Maybe I will be quoting it in slightly different manner because I don't know. But in any way, I've always been interested in visual forms with strong optical properties, such as optical art and early computer graphics, for their formal qualities and for how they grasp the viewer's attention. And I've been reading this, and I thought, it's true. Like, even in my case, I never lived through 80s and early computer graphics. I wasn't born back then. But if I go to museum and there is a digital art exhibition, there is a really, really big chance that what would caught my attention will be the artwork that is pixelated and is made in this aesthetic. So what you said is really true for me. And in general, I want to understand why you think people enjoy watching the pixelated art and in general, the early graphics.
I mean, I can speak for me and I can start from that of why I enjoy it. I think probably the most obvious reason is that I'm 43 years old. So I grew up with those graphics. I at 6 or 7 years old, my father had this old Apple Macintosh, and I was completely fascinated by it. I grew up with CRT screens and early computer video game systems like the Atari 2600. And so, after that initial fascination and obsession with those graphics, when I started working on my art practice over the years, I was trying to understand what was really so appealing and so unique about those graphics. And I think there's different aspects to it. Like one aspect is really optical and kinetic. It's the fact that like looking at images that are backlit on a screen, whether it's a CRT screen or it's a flat screen, it really creates this sort of these optical qualities that are really unique. You know, we talk a lot about digital art, but we don't talk very often about the screen itself, the screen as a display, the fact that it's like projecting light and we're seeing this image through light. And that in and of itself, it has this sort of kinetic optical qualities that are really unique. And so for me in my practice, a lot of my work tries to identify what I'm really interested in this type of optical and kinetic qualities, and isolate them and really work with them and sort of like almost appropriate them and make it my visual language. And then there's another side to it, which is more a side that has to do with the history of graphics and the history of art and the history of a lot of different art forms. And when I look at those graphics and when I look at those pixelated patterns and these early, like, you know, these limited color palettes or this type of motions that we're seeing on the screen, I see connection with art history. I see connection with kinetic art. I see connection with decorative arts. I see connections with tapestry. I see connections with abstraction in painting. And maybe because I went to art school and also because of my early influences in art, I've always tried to sort of make those connections, to be like, okay, I'm making digital work, but what are my inspirations and how do I want to put my work in dialogue with other art forms and maybe with things that also influence me in my work but are completely different. For example, I really, really love landscape painting. I really, really love tapestries, old tapestries. And so that inspires me in my work. And how can I put my work in dialogue with that? So it's multifaceted, I guess. And the other aspect that you mentioned about architecture, very early on when I started exploring this aesthetic in 2008, 2009, I started working a little bit with 3D software. And I was living in Vancouver at the time, and Vancouver was going through a huge real estate boom. They were building a lot of condos everywhere, and you had these crazy showrooms that you could enter, and they had like all the interiors of the condominiums rendered in 3D, all the sort of like landscaping around, like the entire building, basically the entire project rendered in 3D. And what struck me with that is how 3D modeling is sort of almost like a tool to manifest fantasies or to manifest things that don't exist yet. That's how I took it, at least. I think a lot of people maybe look at it differently, but I looked at 3D modeling for this sort of like tool to manifest fantasies, to manifest space that would not maybe be able to exist. And that's kind of how I approach 3D modeling and the use of architecture in my work.
I have one question, just because I've been thinking about it. I will be like really honest. I'm super picky about color intersection in art and in general in life. And I know that you, even like in the beginning, it's basically, I would say, RGB, but not this one. But I believe that I look at all of this collections that you have in here, and I enjoy the color combinations a lot. And I got curious, how come? Yeah, so can you please explain in general, how do you manage the color selection? Is this something that is dictated by the aesthetics of the 80s and 90s? Is this something that just kind of is up to you?
Well, thank you. Do you mean my color choices? Like
exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that page, we're looking at like 15 years of work. So, and I think there's also a lot of works that never made it to my website. So I try to, pick the best ones and keep the other ones just for myself. It's hard to explain like my relationship with color because it really depends on the project. There's like this whole side of my practice that's called patterns, where I try to make works that are inspired by atmospheric forces, and they're very abstract, but they also reference nature or like rain or water, etc. And so for these works, the choice of colors is sort of like, somewhat dictated by that. If I'm trying to represent rain, I'm going to work with like a grayscale or like a dark blue color. If I'm trying to represent a sunset, et cetera, et cetera. With those works, I think it's maybe more case by case. Like the works that you just showed, the planet one and the arch one, they're really influenced, by, I think, a lot of like early video games color palettes, also a lot of sci-fi illustrations, a lot of like pop culture from the 80s and the 90s, where very strong sort of like color palettes are used to try to express something. I'm really sort of interested in any sort of image format that tries to communicate a lot uh, with very little. Like for example, as a teenager and when I was in art school and still now, I was collecting VHS tapes and films, and I was obsessed with VHS cover because the VHS cover sort of like communicates the entire movie just through an image. And like you look at the cover, like a movie poster, basically. You look at the cover and it's trying to tell you what's going to happen in the movie, like what sort of environment you're going to experience, the protagonist, etc. And I always love that idea of like an image that can evoke all these things, that has almost like a narrative embedded in it, but a very open-ended one. So I think when I choose colors and when I make my compositions, I try to work with this color combination that maybe are gonna be able to sort of speak about whatever narrative I'm trying to communicate in the work. The purple and gold one that we're looking now at the top, that was really inspired by early 70s sci-fi. The gold and green one next to it, that was really inspired by optical art and like the work of like Bridget Riley, but also like the Vasulkas. And I was trying to find a color palette that would be colorful, but that would almost feel dated also already. Like that would have a little bit of like a patina almost. And so yeah, for every project it's different. The little island ones that you see like kind of like in the middle, you see like the sort of outlines of the islands. Yeah, that one. That one, it's a series of 4 animation that's inspired by my time in the Gulf Islands off the coast of British Columbia. And I used to go there every summer, and we would organize parties there, like outdoor raves, and I would, because there was lots of friends and I had like these amazing holidays there. So I was trying to communicate, the idea of summers, the idea of like an endless summers, the idea of psychedelia, the idea of like a utopian place through color as well. But I mean, obviously I have this sort of like attraction for very strong saturated colors as well. And I think maybe on like a very simple level, because these colors look so good on screen, and so I sort of want to work with them.
The catching eye, definitely. I imagine seeing this color selection in a gallery on a white wall, and this would be the artwork that would just grab my attention immediately. Well, also, this will be really bad, but I will also put VHS tapes on the screen. First, because I've never used them, to be fair, but I saw one or more in my life. But in general, I also believe that some people from the audience may not be familiar with this word in English. And if I understood correctly, what you've been explaining is that if we go to the tape directly and there is enough whitening on it, we can see the color combination of the film that is taped.
No, it's like if you look at the image, for example, if you type VHS cover,
Okay.
VHS cover, I think you will. Yeah, so you see like this sort of scans of like the cover of the VHS for a movie,
Oh,
like the one for.
wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So when I grew up, we had like lots of video rentals, and that's kind of how you watched movie. We didn't have Netflix, we didn't have
Yeah.
online services like that. You would go to the video rental, and so as a kid, but also as a teenager, I would go to the video rental. I would go straight to like the sci-fi horror section, and I would look at all the covers. And for me, it was sort of like reading novels without reading them. You know, like you see those covers, and there's like these monstrous figures, there's a title, there's sort of like snippets or thumbnails on the back of the cover, and I just really really like love that format. uh, Maybe it's a bit of a stretch to like connect it to my work in the sense that it's like such a different aesthetic, but I guess what I really loved about those covers is the fact that they tell you the story of the movie with just like a few images, you know. And obviously it's a different experience than watching the whole movie, but I love this kind of graphics where you're trying to communicate the story through a very simple image and like this type of narrative element. And maybe speaking about color also, I definitely think that like the aesthetic of this VHS cover influenced my choice of color, you know, because it's really bold, it's really strong, it's like really shameless. It's like, yeah, let's put like lots of really saturated color, or let's work on like these really high contrasts. And yeah, I think I definitely relate to that.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And to be fair, even like the fonts that they went for, even in magazine and all of this publishment in the 90s, was really like really bold, really eye-catching. I believe like the same with your artworks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have this question, and it was written by me. I don't remember why, but I will try to make a guess. So, in general, my assumption is that because this type of aesthetic art of 80s and 90s was either showcased on TV screens or in any other ways, that makes this art slightly unusual to be displayed on digital frame. And this is something I think you've been talking about as a curator who puts together an exhibitions as well, that this particular type of art looks well on the digital screen, but then can the audience relate to it the way they related to it when they were kids watching TV in the 80s, for instance? I hope this question makes sense.
No, it makes total sense. It makes total sense, and it's thank you for asking, because I think it's a really important question. Um, well, I think for net art, but also for any type of art that's shared online, um, the primary context when you experience the art is when you're at home looking at your laptop, and that's a really great context because it's a very intimate context. You know, like potentially you can be looking at art when you're alone at your desk or in your living room. There's no distractions, and so it's a very personal context, right? It's like it's kind of like you can really focus on what you're looking. You can really immerse yourself in what you're looking at. And so if you translate that to a gallery space, that's a completely different context. I mean, the moment you enter a gallery space, you're aware of your body. There's people looking at you. You're looking at people. There's strong lighting. You're like really careful about like the type of gestures that you make. Like you get social anxiety, maybe. Like, I don't know. It's like it's a completely different context. So like translating a work that's being shown on your laptop screen at home to showing it on the same laptop or even on like a slightly bigger screen in a space, to me that never really worked, and that was always like a bit of a disappointing experience. And so very early on I sort of identified that, and I tried to find ways to kind of show my work uh, in a in a better way through different modes when it comes to showing work in physical space. And the interesting things that happened is that starting in 2010, 2011, when I was in Vancouver, I was really involved in the underground electronic music scene there. And some of the DJs and music producers that I was friends with, they saw my work and they invited me to show my work at parties and at raves. And that was a really a click, a haha moment for me because, when you go to raves, usually the lighting is really low, it's really dark, the music is really, really loud, and it's kind of intimate in the sense that people come to dance. And they come to be in their own bubble, and you can socialize if you want, but it's also like a space where like people try to be respectful of one another, and like if you want to just stay in your corner and dance, you can do that. And so I started projecting my work in those like dark spaces at a really large scale, and I realized that that worked so much better than putting a screen in like a white cube space, because all of a sudden like the sort of like the immersive qualities of the work that you would experience on screen, they were scaled up to like the architecture, and people could play with it too. Like when you have a projection, there's a playful element where like you can, the projection can cover parts of your body. And when you're in a dark space, you can really sort of like immerse yourself in it and like lose yourself in it. And when there's really like loud music behind it, especially like electronic music, it sort of works well together. And so then I try to follow that as like a thread and as a guideline to show my work in space. And a lot of the exhibition and a lot of the installations I've done, I've used video projection, and definitely video projection is my favorite medium when it comes to showing my work in space. Or, giant media walls, like really, really large screens or LED panels that cover areas. Because I think it makes sense when you show your work in an environment, and when your work is trying to really captivate the viewer's attention. In a physical space, you compete with lots of stuff. You compete with people, you compete with the architecture, you compete with the lighting, you compete with like the noise on the street and the cars and the advertisement. And so you need to sort of scale things up. And that's not to say that I always want to show my work on like a monumental scale, but I think that scale works really well, especially for like this kind of abstract works that we're looking at right now, because then you can really, like, it's there and it's really present, and it's a big statement, and you can really sort of like lose yourself and appreciate the motion and appreciate the texture. And you don't have to like get like really, really close to the wall to like look at it, and then you're thinking like everybody's looking at you. I think like all these sort of like codes and all these sort of behaviors that happen in like a physical space, they're like, you have to kind of take them into consideration when you show your work in a space. And so that's what I try to do most of the time, but obviously it's also like really case by case, and it depends on the work itself.
Wow, thanks a lot. I had a lot of thoughts. With the kind of exhibition part of it, I think we're handling this kind of social anxiety or awkwardness when we are in general going to these places and institutions like museums and galleries. I don't, but then it is also a part of my life, and it's quite day to day for me. But I know that a lot of people they told me that for them it felt like going to a luxury shop where you feel unwanted or whatever, or not good enough to be there. Mm-hmm. So it just made a lot of sense that like putting your art during the rave would make a lot of sense, because people are struggling with other sorts of social anxieties, like who am I dancing with, where is my drink, whatever. So I think, yeah, and I do believe that your art has this beautiful ability to be showcased in this setting. But then also I'm looking at this picture that is up on the screen right now. And so I'm Ukrainian, and we have a lot of post-modernistic architecture. I do believe that this building as well is also post-modernistic, in a sense that it's like really brutalistic, really simple, minimalistic forms. And in Ukraine, there are like too many of these buildings. There are like a lot of them, and they get so annoying, because the majority of the buildings are like this, like brutalistic, minimalistic, sometimes like extra high, and they feel like something that is pressing down on you. It's just like too much of I don't know, yeah, too much to handle. And I realized that in general, a good way to kind of to make this interaction of minimalistic building and your art or any other art that is a white artwork that can be projected to the building is a really nice way to do it, and a really nice way to develop a cheerful city, a city where you want to walk, and when you feel like enjoying the architecture besides it being the normal architecture that you're used to. Yeah, that's a lot of thoughts.
No, totally. That makes sense, and I mean, I can relate, and I think I understand what you mean by the fact that, you know, this type of architecture, it's here, and it's sort of like almost like a burden, or it's like a load that you have to carry, and you can't really look away from it. It's right there. Whereas I think like one of the qualities of the digital, and especially of video projection, is like it's almost like it can almost appear in a physical space as like this added layer of fantasy. And it's sort of like, I was talking a lot about like the myth of Cinderella when I was doing video projections, because when I was doing video projections for one night at underground venues, it's just for one night, right? And so you arrive in a space and you have this like, these spaces for rave parties, which are not really nice spaces, right? They're like warehouses, or they're like basements, etc. And I would come in and I would make these video projections, and all of a sudden the space would become, I guess, more colorful, more cheerful, more fantastical, and it would just last one night. And I think it's sort of a way to relieve the permanence of architecture too, because architecture is permanent. Architecture is like concrete or wood or bricks, and it's just like it's here to stay. You can't really punch through it. I mean, it's just like really, really heavy, very, very real. And then if you add projection to that, you sort of create this playful intervention that says like, well, you know, it's here, but we can also like pretend that it's something else just for one night or just for like a few hours. And I think there's like a poetic element to that that's really beautiful. And I think also that's why probably like projection mapping has become such a big thing, because it allows artists, but it also allows like cities to kind of have these sort of interventions on some of their public buildings and create a little bit of dialogue around them. And yeah, it's part of the nature of the medium.
That's a really, really nice point. And to be fair, I have the situation in my head. So I'm currently based in Vienna. I think I mentioned before to you. And there are a lot of churches here, especially like Gothic, or I don't know, something in between Gothic and Baroque. And well, in general, just like a really, really big church with a long, I don't remember the name of this thing. And like there are a lot of them, but there is one in the city center, and it has just the purple lightning that would be shining from the bottom to the top of it. And there are like a lot of churches, a lot of really, really beautiful ones. But I have a perfect image of this particular one because of the purple lightning. And it's just a purple lightning. It's not even a projection. And I do remember it so nicely because I immediately had an association with this, you know, like the castle of a protagonist in any movie. They normally live in this like castle that are either purple or green, or the combination of purple and green to showcase that they are like evil. And it felt really bizarre, this color choice on a church. But then as you've been talking, I realized that if you put at least one simple projection or even like an interesting lightning on a building or inside of the building room, kind of people would just notice and people would remember this. And it's a simple way to kind of to improve city and how the city feels and how you interact with it. Really nice point.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, let's move into the project you're working on right now, which is basically RGB Studies. I know it's you've been working on it for a while, and this one is quite special for you. Can you just explain how it works and all of it? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. Yeah, RGB Studies is a project I've been working on for, I feel like the first sort of experimentations I've done with that research date back from 2011 or 2012. Um, and so the project has manifested throughout the years in different forms. But last year, I decided to focus on that project solely, and I created this collection of 90 works focused on figurative landscapes. And the particularity of that project, it's called RGB Studies because I only use red, green, and blue RGB colors to render the animations. So, like for example, if you open one of the animations, when you see it on your screen, and obviously right now it's like a little bit compressed, so it's not quite the same. But when you see it on your screen, it looks like it looks like it's made of millions of colors or thousands of colors.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you zoom in up close, you realize that there's only like 3 colors that make up the work. And so that particular aspect is informed by how screens work and the fact that screens, especially flat screens, the screen we use today on our phones, on our computers, every single pixel, like physically, is not like this pure little square of light. It's actually made of 3 diodes, a red, a green, and a blue diode. And so essentially, like the foundation of a screen is this optical illusion of like when you see a white pixel on your screen, you're not seeing white, you're actually seeing red, green, and blue, but your eye interprets it white as white. And so there's this optical illusion that's embedded into screens that I really wanted to work from because it's something that's so specific to screens. It's something that's so specific to how images are displayed on screens. And I really wanted to create a rendering system or a way to render animation that would use that as its basis. And then there's another aspect to that particular series, which is the landscape aspects, which is something that has been sort of like a constant source of inspiration in my practice over the last 15 years. And one point of inspiration in particular for this project was the work of Georges Seurat, which is a French artist who created this sort of
pointillism, like with the dots, like pointillism. I think this is a term, but in French, I think you will pronounce it better than I do. Like this.
No, it's exactly the term. Yeah, pointillism. Yeah. And so when he made pointillism, basically he would paint these landscapes with just like touches of colors, almost like pixels, except of paint. And at the time, there were a lot of discoveries in colors, and there were a lot of discoveries in optics. And so Seurat was really inspired by that, but he was also trying to think. I think, at least that's my interpretation. I think he was trying to think of his own stakes in these discoveries because of the rise of photography, because of the rise of science. And what does it mean to paint images? What does it mean to make an image when you're a human being and when you're not a machine or when you're not a camera? And I've always been really inspired by landscapes. I've always really been inspired by optical illusions and color theories and optics. And so I guess RGB Studies is my way to try and combine all those interests. And because it's a project that I've been working on for so many years, and it has taken so many different forms. I've done abstract animations, I've done textural animations, I've done figurative animations. Last year, I really wanted to focus solely on that. That's all I've done last year. I've just been making about 200 or 220 of these animations. And then I made like a smaller selections, and then I decided to release that series. Well, it's not released yet, but it's in sort of like private sales right now. But yeah, it's a project I'm really, really proud of because I feel like it kind of goes really at the heart of like some of the things that are like the most important for me in my art practice and in my interests. and yeah, I'll stop there. Like I've just been talking nonstop.
No, not at all. That's an incredible project, and with Georges Seurat, I really enjoy his art. I saw it a couple of times in Paris in Museum d'Orsay. I think there are a lot of these artworks in there, and the thing is that if you look on the screen, it would be like the dots are visible, like, I don't know, this one, for instance. The dots are quite visible, but then if you see it in real life and the further you go back and walk away from it, the more detailed this kind of landscape will look like. And I think it's such a beautiful correlation between his pointillism and how you combine pixels into and three basic primary colors into this collection. And okay, another part of it is that I got really curious. You mentioned there are 85 pieces.
There's 90 pieces, but 85 of them are gonna be for sale. 5 of them I've been keeping. Yeah,
makes sense. And I got curious because in modern times, okay, not like this. Let me paraphrase it. Have you generated the landscapes, or each piece, each of them, like 90 pieces, you were making hand by hand, like yourself manually?
Yeah. So the I'll try to explain the process a little bit, and I'm gonna do a sort of like a behind the scene of how I make this works. But essentially, I draw each landscape originally on Photoshop. I draw it in shades of gray, and so sometimes I look at like photos that I took of like particular landscapes that I love, or I find like found images, and then I use it as reference point, and then I draw the landscape in shades of gray. And once the landscape is drawn in shades of gray, I convert it to bitmap. So essentially what that does is that when you have an image in grayscale in shades of gray, you have millions of colors from white to black or to gray. And then when you translate it to bitmap, you just have two colors. You have black and white. And so it creates this texture on the image. And then I use this texture and I overlap it with moving lines of red, green, and blue pixels. And that creates the animation. That's a very, I guess, simple way to try and explain how I do it. But essentially, it's a lot of back and forth. It's like I first make the landscape, then I try to animate it. I see how the colors work. Then I go back to the initial landscape. I make some modification. Then I animate it again to see how it works. And so each work is sort of time consuming because of that, because there's a lot of back and forth to like adjust the effect. And so, you know, depending on the landscape, for example, if it's a sunset, I'm going to try and have the motion and the textures to be in a particular way to sort of evoke the sun rays filtering through the atmosphere, or the sun reflection on like a body of water. If it's a mountain landscape with fog or mist, I'm going to animate it differently. And so there's an element that I can control, but there's also like a lot of adjustment that are required for every single work. And that's what takes a lot of time because it cannot be automated. It's really case by case, but that's also what is really satisfying to me in this project is like, I start with this idea of a landscape, I draw it, I try to animate it, it doesn't work. I work on it again, it starts working, and then eventually after like a few days or 2 weeks, then it's working perfectly. And so it's there's like a time that is spent with each landscape and with each animation in that sense. But it is sort of hand drawn and hand animated in that regard.
That wow. Okay, so I think like where I am right now is that basically I value a lot when this amount of this quantity is made hand by hand, in a sense that everything is unique, because I do believe it's quite normalized that people use all these other tools that would just simplify this process. So I'm like really impressed in a sense that you managed to create each of it one by one uniquely, from the color combinations and then also the landscape and all of it. Because my first guess was that it was kind of generated, or in a sense that you had inputs, and then what if then this, or I'm not sure if I'm explaining it correctly.
No, yeah. That it was more like sort of like algorithmic or generative, or maybe like there was like some level of automation. Yeah.
Wow, really impressive.
Well,
Well,
I mean, to be honest, sorry to cut you off. To be honest, it's a process I really enjoy, and it's sort of like, for me, it doesn't feel like work when I make these animations. It's just I could spend 12 hours a day doing that, and I would be very happy. So it's kind of, I feel very grateful to have reached that point in my practice where like I can work on a project and really enjoy it. And so I talk about the time, the time consuming aspect, because it's part of the project, it's part of the process. But also, like, I'm really happy while I'm spending all that time doing this work. It's not like a chore or anything like that. And it's yeah, I mean, it's some things that I also appreciate in digital art. I really love generative art. I really love algorithmic art. And I've learned so much since I entered Web3 about this type of art. And I'm really fascinated by it also because it's such a different process from what I do. And on the other hand, I also love very vernacular practices and people spending a lot of time crafting images. And I think when we think of craft, as like this sort of way of making things almost in like an artisanal way, and we think of decorative arts and people doing this, like, or jewelry, etc. I love to think of digital crafts, and I love to think that like there is a continuity in that, and there's a continuity in the sense that there are people that are like crafting images very tediously, that are spending a lot of time in it, that are become very obsessive in it, and that's the type of aesthetic and practices that I really gravitate towards. That I love seeing people kind of sort of like losing themselves in their medium, in their process. Yeah, I just wanted to add that to kind of explain my approach.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I think this is a really interesting thing to know. And this is what I also witnessed partially when I have like the series of webinars with creative coders, and they've been talking about it, and they've been kind of guiding me through their code, and they always have a story. They're like, so I typed this, but then it doesn't work because there was a dot, but I needed a comma. And they are so into this, and they kind of also like dissolve in this process, which is also quite interesting. And this is how I want to go to our like quite final question. What would be your tips or advice for people who want to explore computer art? It can be tips for artists, or maybe in general for the public, whatever is best for you.
That's a tough one. One thing I want to add to is that, like, I'll answer your question in 1 second, but I forgot to mention this. Like, RGB Studies right now, it's in a private sale phase. But if anybody's watching this show and wants to learn more about it, they can absolutely message me, and I will answer them and I will send them more info.
Just a sec, let's focus on this one. I just want to pull on your profile on X. So yeah, basically Nicolas Sassoon, and you can find Nicolas and text him right away, just to be sure we cover this one properly.
Thank you so much. Yeah, like tips for how to approach computer art. That's a broad one. I mean, I guess it really depends where you're coming from, but I personally discovered computer art through browsing online, and I discovered some blogs from artists that I really loved, and then I messaged them and I started trying to talk to them, and I was trying to be really, sincere with them, being like, I really love your art. I really love what you're doing. Can you tell me more about it? And I feel like that's maybe like a good way to, that's one possible way to go about it, is to try to have conversations. I feel like this sort of conversations are really really important, and it's not always going to work. Like if you contact an artist or if you contact someone that you want to like learn from or discuss with, they're not always going to be willing to talk, but I think it's worth trying, because I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like it's sort of like the way that we learn the most is when we contact somebody that we look up to or that we admire or that we respect, and we ask them questions and we have a dialogue with them. Uh, in terms of resources online for computer art, it's sort of hard because there's so many. It's sort of like exploded, but obviously going to museums whenever there's an exhibition on digital and computer art can be interesting, even though sometimes those exhibitions can be also disappointing. Uh, and tips for artists, I would say try to create a community around you. That's what I say always now, because I feel like that's so important, is to have a community of people that you can rely on and that can rely on you, and that you can have like genuine sort of like interactions with, because there's often that image of like the artists doing their work alone and being this sort of like, I don't know, like heroic figure making huge sales and breaking new grounds. And I think the reality of art is that it's a marathon. It's, you have ups and downs. You have moments in your career where you have a lot of success. You have moments in your career where you're really down. And so it's important to create this. I mean, to me, what really, really helps me is to have these people around me that I can rely on and that can rely on me and that are like genuine friends, because you're gonna need them eventually, one day or another. And so, yeah, I mean, as far as like careers go, I think like, everybody has their own advice on like how to run your career, how to do sales, how to show your work. And I'm not going to add to that because I think there's enough resources and voices online about that. But I would definitely say like the human aspect of it and the community aspect of it, to me, is like, it's essential and it's not talked about enough in my opinion.
That's a really beautiful advice. Yeah, I agree. And even I'm not an artist, but I do believe as a freelancer, I have such a bad career periods in my life, but then also I have a really, really incredible phases. I would say that when I had like a normal stable job, everything was quite like in the middle. But once you go out there and you are kind of managing your work life yourself, then you have this kind of up and down dynamics. But it's always fun to manage through it. It's a beautiful thought, and I do believe that a lot of my former colleagues or people that worked with me were the people that helped me go through every phase of it, the good and the bad. So yeah. Now, okay, Nicolas, thank you so much for joining me today. I think it was a really, really nice webinar, especially in a sense that we kind of explored this aesthetic, but then also dived into architecture and how you still work on this pixel aesthetic. And I think we are seeing this trend of coming back to it if we're not in it right now. And I just want to thank you so much for joining me today and sharing all of this.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the chat.
Have a lovely day. Bye.
Bye bye.